Okay. All right. We'll begin. This is prep for Wednesday office hours, the 14th of January. And the text we're looking at before the last thing I looked at was in preparation to think about, anyway, Gabriel Rockhill's work. But before that, um, I decided that we might look at Torkel Lausen's long transition towards socialism and the end, the end of capitalism. So this is where we will start. As I mentioned in the other thing, we were looking at a graph or a chart to show kind of historical timeline from the beginnings of capitalism to whatever its end or the beginning of socialism. That's kind of what this book is about. I mean, his prior book was mainly to look at capitalism. This one is to anticipate socialism. So we'll just go through the introduction and the first chapter, and we may go to the conclusion towards the strategy for the transition to socialism. Needless to say, we have a copy available. Let me begin on a personal note. My motivation to write the book: I've been studying the political economy and history of capitalism since the late 1960s, collecting a pile of puzzle pieces of information. When one gets old, there's a tendency to move towards grand theory. One wants to assemble the puzzle and get the full picture and understand the process. Trying to envision in which direction it is moving. Most of my writing has been concerned with critiquing capitalism and imperialism. Sometimes I've been challenged with this question. I share your critique of capitalism, but what about the alternative? There have been many attempts to build socialism in the past, but they have not been very successful, neither in terms of delivering material goods nor democracy. In this book, I respond to this line of argument. When one tries to write the history of the efforts to build socialism, one writes not only against hundreds of years of the European sense of superiority and anti-communism, but also against the disillusioned socialists whose ideals have been betrayed. However, the establishment of socialism is not some kind of ingenious social engineering. Socialism is developed based on technology and knowledge. The productive forces of capitalism, when the capitalist mode of production, the way it manages society, stands in the way of the development of the productive forces, then the transformation to socialism becomes possible. Now, how is this contradiction expressed? In the form of structural, political, and economic crises, and in the current destruction of the foundation of human life itself. These crises give rise to class struggles, which contain within them the transformative power towards socialism. Industrial capitalism has now lasted for 200 years and is reaching a turning point where it has become a serious burden for the development of humanity on Earth. Unfortunately, we've developed more than just technology and scientific knowledge from capitalism. Its culture of selfishness and greed will not simply disappear, nor will the ecological problems it's created. Socialism is not destined to succeed capitalism. Capitalism can collapse in a brutal, chaotic endgame of wars and natural disasters. To avoid this is our task. And to accomplish that task, we must fulfill the transition to socialism. Now, to do this, we need to learn from the past and mobilize, organize, and develop a strategy for future struggles. The purpose of analyzing the attempts to build socialism is not just to understand the world as it is, but to develop the strategies to produce the world as it should be. To see the struggle for socialism as a long process of global transformation since the mid-19th century, there is also somehow comforting on a psychological level for an old man. The struggle and suffering of billions of communists and socialists for the past 200 years have not been in vain, but are contributions to this long process of creating a better world. To be part of this process, a tiny cogwheel in the machinery of transformation, and to give it a little push in the right direction seems to be the meaning of life. Not founded in some religion or belief of life after death, but founded in historical materialism and the meaning of life before death, to hand over a world more equal and in balance with nature to future generations. The problem for the next generation, however, is that we're running out of time. Our task as the subjective forces is to work for a transformation of the system into a more democratic and equal world order in balance with nature in the next several decades. In this book, I examine the major revolutionary attempts from 1848 to the present to see what can be learned in terms of building an organization and developing political and economic strategies. There are many revolutions and struggles that I do not cover or which are only mentioned in passing due to space constraints of a book that's already long, all 400 some odd pages. To see the transition as a long and global process is not only a matter of theory, it also has practical political implications. The current lack of confidence in socialism is, to a great extent, due to the disappointment with the experiences of socialism in the Soviet Union, China, Eastern Europe, Cuba, Algeria, Vietnam, Mozambique, and so on. However, these experiences were not experiences of socialism. They were just a series of attempts to build socialism within the sea of capitalism. In fact, only Stalin claimed that socialism was established in the Soviet Union in 1936. And that probably is the case. Although you could argue that there was a moment in the People's Republic of China when that occurred, but didn't occur for very long. And anyway, these transformations towards socialism have taken place within the framework of and in dialectic relations with capitalism. The different stages of the development of capitalism have had a huge impact on the attempt to build socialism. And the attempts to build socialism have modified the development of capitalism. I've described the history of capitalism in my book, The Global Perspective. However, in this book, I focus instead on socialism itself to draw some lessons for the development of a strategy for the coming struggle. The quest for socialism is as old as capitalism, and the idea of a society without exploitation is much older. Thomas More wrote Utopia in 1516 about a society where the community came before profit. Private property was unknown, and in which workers controlled the means of production. The French author Pierre Leroux is credited with coining the term socialism, derived from the Latin word socialis, meaning sociable. In the beginning, it was connected to the idea of a social contract. Robert Owen used the word as early as 1835. In the 1840s, the word socialism was used to mean a social system based on state or other forms of collective ownership of the means of production and regulation of distribution to common benefit for all members of society. The word communism derived from the Latin communis, meaning common, and appeared in the 1840s as a theory that promotes the abolition of private property and the organization of work to the benefit of all members of society. In the first part of the 1840s, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were not very accommodating to these very utopian forms, these early utopian forms of socialism and communism. Theorists such as Moses Hess and Wilhelm Weitling dragged Marx and Engels toward socialism. Weitling, a prominent figure in early German communism, was a tailor. As opposed to the utopians, he did not believe in reforms from the ruling classes. In fact, instead, the workers should organize themselves and carry out the revolution. Later, in 1846, Marx broke off his relationship with Weitling due to differences over how to organize the working class. In 1890, Engels, in a new preface to the Communist Manifesto, described the socialist and communist movement in 1847. Nevertheless, when it appeared, we could not have called it a socialist manifesto. In 1847, two kinds of people were considered socialists. On the one hand were the adherents of the various utopian systems, notably the Owenites in England and the Fourierists in France, both of whom, at that date, had already dwindled to mere sects, gradually dying out. On the other, the manifold types of social quacks who wanted to eliminate social abuses through their various universal panaceas and all kinds of patchwork without hurting capital and profit in the least. In both cases, people who stood outside the labor movement of the working class, however, who stood outside the labor movement and looked for support rather to the educated classes. The section of the working class, however, which demanded a radical reconstruction of society, convinced that mere political revolutions were not enough, then called itself communist. It was still a rough-hewn, only instinctive and frequently somewhat crude communism. Yet it was powerful enough to bring into being two systems of utopian communism. In France, the Icarian communists of Cabet, and in Germany, that of Weitling. Socialism in 1847 signified a bourgeois movement, communism a working class movement. Socialism was, on the continent at least, quite respectable, whereas communism was the very opposite. And since we were very decidedly of the opinion as early as then that the emancipation of the workers must be the task of the working class itself, we could have had no hesitation as to which of the two names we should choose, nor has it ever occurred to us to repudiate it, close quote. During their lifetimes, Marx and Engels developed their perception of socialism and communism without pointing out or explaining the differences, perhaps because they did not believe in a fixed and ideal definition of socialism. It was a mode of production that would originate out of a specific historical situation, which to a large extent would define its content. Engels, in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, identifies the founders of socialism as Henri de Saint-Simon, Owen, and Charles Fourier, and he refers to the actual communistic theories of Etienne Gabriel Morelli and Gabriel Bonneau de Mable. Proudhon and Louis Blanc both produced plans for a communist organization of society in the first of the 19th century. Marx was familiar with this tradition and assimilated, criticized, and modified many of his predecessors' ideas. From Saint-Simon stems the idea of a planned economy. From Proudhon, Marx heard that property is theft. From Louis Blanc, the precept from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Lenin states that Marx's ideas are a synthesis of French socialism, German idealist philosophy, and British political economy. However, there is something more to add. Marx's work was part of the scientific breakthroughs of the mid-19th century and the subsequent organization of knowledge into modern academic disciplines. Besides the significant developments in the social sciences, there were major discoveries in natural science, the Earth's geological history, biological cells, the origin of species, and energy transformation. Marx's ideas were highly influenced by natural science. One example is Marx's theory of the metabolic rift. It was built on the German chemist Justus von Liebig's observations on how nutrients were systematically removed from the soil in the form of agricultural products and shipped hundreds and even thousands of miles to the new urban centers. The result was pollution in the cities and less fertile soil. Based on Liebig's research, Marx's critique of political economy included an ecological critique dialectically connected to his overall analysis of capitalist production. The capitalist mode of production disrupted human relations to nature and thereby provoked an irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism, a metabolism prescribed by the natural laws of life itself. Marx also developed the notion of sustainability, arguing that humans do not own the earth, but need to sustain it for future generations as quote unquote good heads of the household. Socialism was defined in Volume 3 of Capital as the rational regulation by the associated producers of the metabolism of nature and society to conserve energy and promote human development. The new scientists, such as Charles Darwin and Liebig, shared the same materialist perception of how and why things happen. Marx was an empirical scientist par excellence. He used statistics, reports, parliamentary proceedings, figures in trade, and shipping logs as empirical support for his theories. What makes Marx special among contemporaneous scientists was that he connected different parts of science into a systemic theory, that is, history, sociology, economics, and different parts of natural science. What distinguished Marx and Engels from their predecessors is that communism was no utopian dream, but a realistic endeavor based on a scientific theory of history, that is, historical materialism. Just as the rising bourgeoisie had overthrown feudalism to create capitalism, the working class would overthrow capitalism and construct communism. Marx did not specify how a socialist society should be run. However, he reckoned that society and technology would upend classes, abolish capitalism, and make an equitable and prosperous future possible and likely. One of the first times that Marx and Engels wrote about communism is in the German Ideology, written in 1845 to 1846. This alienation, use a term which will be comprehensible to the philosophers, can, of course, only be abolished given two practical premises. For it to become an intolerable power, that is, i.e., a power against which men make a revolution, it must necessarily have rendered the great mass of humanity propertyless and produced at the same time the contradiction of an existing world of wealth and culture, both of which conditions presuppose a great increase in productive power, a high degree of its development. And on the other hand, this development of productive forces, which itself implies the actual empirical existence of men in their world, historical instead of local being, is an absolutely necessary practical premise, because without it, want is merely made general, and with destitution, the struggle for necessities and all the old filthy business would necessarily be reproduced. And furthermore, because only with this universal development of productive forces is a universal intercourse between men established, which produces in all nations simultaneously the phenomenon of the propertyless mass. Universal competition makes each nation dependent on the revolutions of the others, and finally has put world historical, empirically universal individuals in place of local ones. Now, without this, one, communism could only exist as a local event. Number two, the forces of intercourse themselves would not develop as universal, hence intolerable powers. They would have remained homebred conditions surrounded by superstition, sounds familiar. And three, such extension of intercourse would abolish local communism. Empirically, communism is only possible as the act of the dominant peoples all at once, and simultaneously, which presupposes the universal developments of productive forces and the world intercourse bound up with communism. Moreover, the mass of propertyless workers, that is, the utterly precarious position of labor, power on a mass scale cut off from capital, or even a limited satisfaction, and therefore no longer merely temporarily deprived of work itself as a secure form of life, presupposes the world market through competition. The proletariat can thus only exist world historically, just as communism. Its activity can only have a quote unquote world historical existence. World historical existence of individuals means existence of individuals, which is directly linked up with world history. Communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. No, we call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The conditions of this movement result from the premises now in existence, close quote. Now, what Marx and Engels are doing here is giving a credible forecast of the possible development of communism. As it does not yet exist, one cannot analyze it. The premise for the development of communism is that the vast majority of the masses are proletarians, propertyless wage laborers. A certain level in the development of the productive forces is also necessary. Socialism with less developed productive forces would only mean the generalization of poverty. Another strategic insight is that it is hard to imagine that communism can exist as a local project. It would produce hostility with the surrounding capitalist world. And finally, the communism is not an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. Rather, it is a movement which abolishes the present state of things on the conditions of the existing world. Now, all of these thoughts were presented in the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Communism and socialism are no longer utopian ideas of a better society, but a prognosis built on an analysis of history, sociology, and a critique of political economy. So that's a good sort of overall introduction, and I would assert really all the reasons why one has to kind of at least believe in a movement towards communism. Now, abstract of the book. I take a long and global perspective in my investigation of the struggle for socialism. Since capitalism was born, developed, and accumulated as a world system, the analytic perspective has to be global. In addition, the transformation towards socialism must comprise the vast majority of the world system to be effective. The many local and national attempts to build socialism in the past 2 centuries have to be seen as part of a long transition process rather than failures, attempts which have contributed to the progress of the transition by modifying capitalism, as well as to the learning process of how to develop socialism. Historical periods do not follow one another as one step follows the other. Quote, history moves often in leaps and bounds and in a zigzag line, unquote, as mentioned by Engels. And the different modes of production interpenetrate and coexist over a long period of time. Any national revolution is a factor in changing the nature of not only a single nation, but also the entire world system. The way capitalism works today is a product of the Russian Revolution and Soviet industrialization, the anti-colonial uprisings in the Third World, the 1968 uprising, and the current Chinese development of socialism. Now, this book is divided into 3 parts. In the first part, I present my method, its core concepts, and some theoretical and philosophical reflections to be used in the analysis. As the development of capitalism is a global process, this process has a principal contradiction which shapes the transformation towards socialism. The principal contradiction is the specific historical presentation of the general contradiction in capitalism between the development of the productive forces and the mode of production. The principal contradiction is the specific historical presentation of the general contradiction in capitalism between the development of the productive forces and the mode of production. Sorry to repeat that, but I think that's the thing around which everything occurs. The principal contradiction changes over time as the balance of its aspect changes through feedback from class struggle generated by the contradiction. Since the theme of the book is the transition from capitalism to socialism, I also discuss the basic difference between the two modes of production. The first part ends with a discussion of some moral aspects of political struggle. In the second part, I use these methods and concepts to analyze the history of major revolutions and their interactions with the capitalist world system. The Russian and Chinese revolutions and their subsequent attempts to construct socialism are, of course, important elements of my analysis. So are the revolutionary spirit of the long 60s and the various other attempts to build socialism in the Third World. However, this is not primarily a history book. I focus on forms of political action, types of movements, and their forms of organization, strategies, and tactics. What are the lessons to be learned from different struggles? Marx and Engels had a general vision of the transition from capitalism to socialism as a series of revolutions starting in Western Europe and spreading globally, driven by a proletarian struggle with a degree of international coordination and solidarity. Hence, the need to organize, quote unquote, the international. With Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the creation of a new type of long-term professional revolutionary, that is, the strategy for the world revolution and the construction of socialism became a bit more specific. The revolutionary center had moved from the core of the advanced capitalist countries to its margins, that is, Russia and China, due to their position as, quote unquote, weak links in the capitalist world system. This development was a consequence of the polarizing effect created by the colonial expansion of capitalism, which dampened the revolutionary spirit in the advanced countries in the West, yet amplified the need for a revolution in the East. This change of location within the world system also changed the model of transition from capitalism to socialism. In traditional Marxist thinking, the socialist mode of production does not develop within the old capitalist mode of production as capitalism did within feudalism, but rather replaces it when capitalism has exhausted its possibility to develop productive forces. However, in Russia and China, capitalism was underdeveloped. The revolutions occurred because their route to the development of productive forces within the world system was blocked by, yes, imperialism. The long transition from capitalism to socialism has therefore evolved not only through the class struggle between capital and labor on the national level, but also through struggles between states who wanted to promote capitalism and the post-revolutionary states who want to use elements of capitalism to develop their productive forces in order to build socialism. So, on the one hand, we have a history of 200 years of unsuccessful attempts to end capitalism and construct socialism. The term socialism in this process is discredited in many ways. On the other hand, it is obvious to more and more people that capitalism cannot continue, as its form of accumulation creates misery along with the destruction of the global environment. Capitalism is ripe for replacement by another mode of production, which can provide an equal democratic world in balance with nature. But this leaves many questions. Replacement by what and how? Which way is China heading? Are new revolutions on the horizon as consequences of the capitalist crises? Will capitalism break down in chaos from which a lifeboat socialism will emerge? Now, the third part of this book draws some lessons on how to construct socialism. The socialist mode of production is not an ideal utopia. It is a solution to the problems caused by centuries of capitalism. The capitalist mode of production has turned from a dynamic system leading to the huge development of the productive forces to a system that blocks the solution to global problems and hence and thereby the continuation of human development on Earth. The continued development of the productive forces demands a socialist mode of production. The task is to develop this mode of production as a realistic, rational praxis of how we manage society. How do we produce, divide, and consume the social products to solve global inequality and ecological problems? So in the final part of the book, I analyze the structural crises of capitalism and try to cast some light on possible roads towards socialism. I do not believe that capitalism will survive this century. Capitalism reached its zenith around 2000, still dominant, but it is in decline, reflected in the turn from neoliberal economic globalization towards military defense of a U.S. hegemony that is no longer economically based. The decline of U.S. hegemony and the rise of China as a driver for a more multipolar world system can lead to a geopolitical balance in which social movements and nations in the global south can move in the direction of socialism. The situation has some similarities with the long 60s, that is 1955 to 1975, when the balance between the U.S. First World and the Second World, the socialist bloc led by the Soviet Union, opened up space for decolonization with a socialist perspective. However, at that time, Western capitalism was still virile. It was superior in technological terms, as it was leading in industrial production, and it ruled the world market. The Third World couldn't turn national liberation into economic liberation from imperialism. The socialist bloc at the time did not have the technological and economic strength to support such a change. The Third World was not able to cut off the pipelines of imperialism. Instead, U.S. imperialism wriggled free of the anti-imperialist offensive and launched neoliberal globalization as a counterattack, which gave it 40 golden years 40 golden years under U.S. hegemony. The situation is different today. The U.S. is no longer the driving force in the development of the productive forces on a global scale. They do not have a monopoly on high-tech development, and they do not dominate global trade. Well, the socialist bloc already was in a political and economic downturn in the late 1970s. China has a tailwind. It is the leading industrial producer and the biggest actor in the world market. It is a driving force behind the effort to establish a multipolar world system. The intergovernmental organization BRICS, B-R-I-C-S, has united the largest global South economies of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. In August 2023, it also added Saudi Arabia, Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, Argentina, and the United Arab Emirates. Now, as the membership indicates, not a socialist bloc or even an anti-imperialist bloc. It includes very reactionary and conservative capitalist regimes. Duh. What unites them is that they no longer believe that the interests of the West are equivalent to their interests. They want to develop an alternative to the U.S. dollar-dominated trade and financial system. Many other countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America are supporting this agenda. Now, this is significant for shifts in the world balance as it is now increasingly south-south, that is south-south, after 500 years of uneven north-south economic relations. The decline of U.S. hegemony, and the emerging alternative financial world system may give the third world the possibility to accomplish the economic transformation as it could not make, the economic transformation it could not make in the 1970s. Imperialism is crumbling. The ruling elite has calculated that the U.S. cannot compete with China economically, making China's rise an existential threat to the future of U.S.-led imperialism. This made the U.S. switch strategies from economic competition to geopolitical territorial rivalry. However, in this process of economic warfare, using boycotts, blockades, and economic punishment packets, the transnational institutions built under neoliberalism are eroding. The globalized market of neoliberalism is split apart. The U.S. is destroying the goose, which for the last few decades was laying golden eggs. The transformation towards socialism can be smooth as the global South gradually delinks from imperialism, building socialism with different national characteristics and creating an alternative international economic world order. Or the transformation can be traumatic, resulting in global wars, including the use of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. Then the transition will be, if not quote unquote the end, then starting from scratch. We must avoid this outcome. We must avoid revolutionary adventurism in our strategy. If capitalism is still dominant in the second part of the century, then catastrophic economic and social problems related to climate change will play a huge role. It is in these unstable and dramatic circumstances that the end game of capitalism must be played out. The strategy for this struggle is discussed at the end of the book. Now, in my analyses and discussions, I hope to develop a form of applied thinking that does not reduce itself to pragmatic or cynical reformism, nor turn into a critique based on abstract or romantic ideals of communism, nor devolve into explanations based on conspiracy and personal treason. Much discussion related to the development of socialism is focused on the struggle between different political lines within communist parties, operating first in the Soviet Union and later in China, instead of the actual material conditions which these lines represent. My judgment of these struggles does not rest on some sacred socialist values, but on being rational. When things go wrong, it is not necessarily because of mistakes or treason of subjective forces, nor because of communists betraying the true values of socialism. The history I want to review is not a history of morals. For a materialist approach, the questions of betrayal or rectitude have only minor relevance. The struggle for socialism is a collective project created by the effort and support of millions over the past 200 years. A specific economic and political constellation in the world system can make it impossible to move in the direction of socialism at any given point in history. A detour might be necessary. Now, this does not mean that there are always excuses when things go wrong. Mistakes and treason do happen. However, we should be careful to not retreat to idealism and hand out a quick verdict, but rather conduct a dialectical, historical, materialist analysis of the facts so that we might learn from history. Marx and Engels were hesitant to describe communism in specific details because the development of the new mode of production would not be the result of ideal imagination. Marx and Engels rigidly refused to paint pictures of future communist society, as Eric Hobsbawm says. Marx did not paint pictures with brush and oil. Rather, he took photographs of the world. That is to say, he sought the development of communism in the context of the real movement. An analysis of the real movement is a necessary step toward developing a communist practice worthy of its name. The possibility of a successful and stable transition toward socialism will be limited if it only takes place in one country or region. That's an important point. There has not been one sole socialist country at any point in time, not in the Soviet Union, nor in China or elsewhere. Socialism in one country has obviously not been a success. A genuine and comprehensive transfer from capitalism to socialism has to involve the majority of the world. Capitalism is a global system, and the attempts to escape it from any nation state have immediately been confronted by the surrounding dominant capitalist powers. However, the road towards global socialism passes necessarily through national struggles. The national state is still the primary political framework in the world system. Thus, any national struggle has to be fought with a clear understanding of the global perspective, prioritizing internationalism, both in terms of economic and political cooperation. Now, there have been many attempts to build socialism in the past. Their failure does not necessarily mean that their strategies were wrong, that their attempts were fruitless, or that their mission is impossible. The transformation from capitalism towards socialism is a long, ongoing historical process of effort, learning, and trials as the capitalist mode of production runs out of options and it declines. As the capitalist mode of production is reaching its limits in economic, political, and ecological terms, the transition towards socialism becomes urgent if we are not to end up in a chaotic collapse of capitalism. Part 1, perspective, methods, and concepts. Now, there are many reasons why people want socialism. Some people want socialism because they can hardly earn a living despite hard work. Others want socialism because capitalism is in the process of destroying the Earth's ecosystem, or because it leads to war. Yet others want socialism because the current system causes alienation and stress, and they want more community, less inequality, more common property, and so on. Without anger and a burning desire to change the world, it is not possible to mobilize and organize the forces that will create radical change. It is these forces we call the subjective forces of revolution. However, it is also a common experience that revolution and the establishment of socialism do not occur just because people want it. In the 1960s and 70s, millions of people wanted to and did fight and die for socialism. There were dozens of strong revolutionary movements with a socialist perspective, from Southeast Asia across the Middle East to Africa and Latin America. Even in North America and Europe, the movements of 1968 put socialism on the agenda. However, this wave fizzled out. The possibility of radical change depends not only on the wish, will, and organizational strength of subjective forces, it also depends on the contradiction within the mode of production, that is, those objective conditions. Subjective forces, objective conditions. Chapter 1, my method. This historical and dialectical materialism are very broad terms, covering many approaches and reaching many different conclusions. Therefore, I need to be more specific in my definition of historical and dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism is not just a research method, it is the conscious capacity of seeing society as a process and of understanding the direction and eventual goal of that process. The world is therefore in constant transformation. Any phenomenon has a past and a future, growing out of a synthesis of external and internal contradictions of this past. It presents itself to us in its current form. This is already due to the action of its own combination of contradictions, changing and giving rise to different future possibilities. The future world both preserves traces of the past and gives rise to new relationships, structures, activities, and ideas. The meaning of seeing things as a whole lies in the ensuing capacity to act in line with reality thus understood. The future is dependent on the action of people who, under the influence of internal and external contradictions, change the present through transformative praxis. What distinguishes Marxist analysis is that it produces the theoretical insight that complements the kind of action that changes the world. My interpretation of dialectical materialism is not very philosophical. It is more a tool for analysis. It's more a tool for analysis to develop strategy and thereby practice. My method depends on three pillars. The first is this global perspective, which understands the world as a whole. As Marx writes in Conclusions from the Materialist Conception of History, quote, the more the original isolation of the separate nationalities is destroyed by the developed mode of production and intercourse and the division of labor between various nations naturally brought forth by these, the more history becomes world history, unquote. The global perspective is grounded in both the history of capitalism as a world system and the development towards a global value of labor and goods within that system. Taking the global perspective might seem obvious, but it is not so. Most political strategies take the starting point of the local perspective and then add the international perspective as an afterthought. The second pillar of the three pillars is the driver of this process. The contradiction between the development of the productive forces and the mode of production. This general contradiction has taken different forms in the history of capitalism as the system attempts to find a way to continue the development of the forces of production within the capitalist mode. This leads us to the third pillar, the principal contradiction. If the development of global capitalism is one process, then this process has a principal contradiction. The principal contradiction determines the outcome of the local contradiction, but is at the same time modified by it. That's what makes it dialectical. In this interaction, the principal contradiction changes over time. The concept of the principal contradiction takes us from the general level to the specific level. It is a tool for developing strategy and practice. Now, let us look at these three assumptions, these three pillars in detail. Firstly, the global perspective. First, I want to emphasize the use of the global perspective, the understanding of the world system, the world system as a multiplicity of cultures and political systems integrated into an extensive division of labor within a single world economy. Capitalism was born in a long process of global colonization from 1500 to 1900, giving rise to the development of this particular economic system in Europe. Wallerstein has described this process in detailed historical and political terms in his 4-volume work, The Modern World System. Wallerstein argued that capitalism is a historical system that's gradually built Northwestern Europe and North America as the core, a few other countries as the semi-periphery, and most of the world as the periphery. The process of colonialism connected and polarized the world simultaneously into an imperial center and its exploited periphery. The arrangement was necessary for the continued accumulation of capital. The extra surplus value generated by the exploitation of low-wage labor in the periphery secured the rate of profit and funneled the spoils of this ever-expanding market toward the imperial core. Wallerstein's theoretical framework originates from dependency theory, which was a response to the development theory of the 1950s, according to which the underdeveloped countries in the third world had to progress on a similar path as the US and Europe. Now, a group of scholars turned this paradigm around and claim that Europe has developed due to the plunder and exploitation of the third world. Andre Gunder Frank's The Development of Underdevelopment, 1966, Giovanni Arrighi's The Political Economy of Rhodesia, Arrighi Emanuel's Unequal Exchange, Samir Amin's Accumulation on a World Scale, Roy Marini's Dialectics of Dependency, and Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa are examples of discussions within and between radicals of Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America in the 1960s and 70s. Emanuel and Amin underlined the quote-unquote transfers of value by unequal exchange between these so-called underdeveloped countries to so-called developed countries, and that this is the essence of capitalist accumulation on a world scale. Amin argued that Marx's bourgeoisie and proletariat could be mapped to nations of the globe rather than as classes within nation states. The current iteration of capitalism is not just enclosure. It is also the appropriation of wealth from the colonies. Emanuel and Amin were central in sparking world systems analysis, but they're also influential in extending this analysis into the realm of political economy by describing the creation of global value. The worldwide law of value operates through a truncated market that integrates goods and capital globally. But this is not applied to the labor force, and hence not to the price of labor, that is, the wage. Everything is built on, political economy is built on this distinction. The worldwide law of value operates through a truncated market that integrates goods and capital globally, but it is not applied to the labor force, and hence not to the price of labor, that is, the wage. In today's system of neoliberal capitalism, there is a global market for capital and commodities with globalized production chains linking together labor power in the North and South. Furthermore, with the increased industrialization of the global South over the last several decades, the level of technology and management regimes are also becoming similar on a global level. The value of a commodity is no longer based in varied and isolated national conditions. The value is based on global conditions, and as such, labor power has a globalized value. As Samir Amin explained, my major contribution concerns the passage from the law of value to the law of globalized value based on the hierarchical structuring, itself globalized, of the price of labor power around its value. This globalized value constitutes the basis for imperialist rent, close quote. The seaport worker who loads containers in Shanghai creates as much value as the port worker in Rotterdam who unloads them, assuming that the work is of the same intensity and uses the same technology of those containers. The price of labor power, that is the wage, varies due to the different histories, social relations, and political conditions, and the limited mobility of labor. As Samir Amin noted, capitalism is not the United States and Germany, with India and Ethiopia only halfway capitalist. Capitalism is the United States and India, Germany, and Ethiopia taken together. This means that labor power is but a single value, that which is associated with the level of development of the productive forces taken globally. The productive forces taken globally. In answer to the polemical argument that had been put against him, how can one compare the value of an hour of work in the Congo to that of a labor hour in the United States? Aguirre Emanuel wrote, quote, just as one compares the value of an hour's work by a New York hairdresser to that of an hour's labor by a worker in Detroit, you have to be consistent. You cannot invoke inescapable globalization when it suits you and refuses to consider it when you find it troublesome. Now, however, though there exists but one sole value of labor power, remember, labor power and labor hour, right? On the scale of globalized capitalism, that labor power, not labor, labor power is nonetheless recompensed recompensed at very different rates. The combination, and it pivots on the issue of rates, needless to say. This is where Marxian political economy comes back in. The combination of globalized value and low wages in the South is the basis for the extraction of super surplus value, which generates super profits for capital and relatively low commodity prices relative to northern wage levels. The difference between the value of labor and its price, the price of labor, therefore corresponds, the price of labor being its wage, right? Therefore corresponds to a transfer of value from the South to both capital and labor in the North. Therefore, my global perspective is founded on the historical development of the world system and the prevalence of globalized value in capitalism. Productive forces and the mode of production. What is the driver of the development of capitalism? What is the contradiction that forces it to move ahead and constantly expand and change its appearance? Now, the conventional Marxist answer is class struggle. However, change depends not only on the subjective conditions, that is, the conditions of subjects, it also depends on objective conditions. As Marx explains it, quote, in the social production of their existence, people inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, this is a base superstructure argument, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. It's all right there. Close quote. The prospects of revolution are determined by whether the existing relations of production promote or inhibit the development of the productive forces. The status of that contradiction is what we call the material or objective conditions for revolution. Let me elaborate on this. Marx and Engels write in the Communist Manifesto, quote, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. Oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes, unquote. Class struggle, therefore, is a manifestation of an underlying contradiction. What Marx and Engels discovered was the foundation on which class struggle takes place. On the one hand, production maintains and develops society through a comprehensive division and organization of labor, the social character of production. But on the other hand, there exists the private ownership of the means of production and thus the drive for private profit, regardless of the social needs or consequences. With this contradiction in mind, Marx and Engels laid the foundations of historical materialism. As Marx wrote in 1859, quote, "In studying such transformation, it's always necessary to distinguish between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, artistic, or philosophic. In short, ideological forms in which people become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Just as one does not judge an individual by what they think about themselves, so one cannot judge such a period of transformation by its consciousness. But, on the contrary, this consciousness must be explained from the contradictions of material life, from the conflict existing between the social forces of production and the relations of production. Social forces of production and the relations of production are in conflict." Close quote. If we look at society as a whole, the fundamental contradiction is between the development of productive forces and the relations of production. The productive forces stand for, of course, technologies, practical and scientific knowledge, logistics, and management. The relations of production, on the other hand, stand for the relations that humans enter into when using productive forces. First and foremost, they concern property relations. The contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production exists in all societies. It defines societies and their classes. In capitalism, it takes the form of the contradiction between the social character of production and the private ownership of the means of production. Or, as Engels puts it in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, the contradiction between social production and capitalist appropriation. This refers to the fact that, on the one hand, production creates the basis of our lives and develops society with the help of an extensive division of labor between workers as well as between corporations, while on the other hand, this is done based on the means of production being privately owned. Now, despite the damaged brand of socialism, in the past decades, this contradiction is expressed in common everyday considerations. Why not share and have more common wealth instead of individual consumption? Why are the financial capitalists so greedy and rich while there's so many poor people? Why do humans not live in balance with nature and instead destroy the living conditions of future generations? Because the conflict between capital and labor is the class expression of the basic contradiction of society. It is obvious that it ultimately determines when the class contradiction assumes the form of open antagonism and develops into revolution. When the property relations, that is, the way we produce and consume, conflicts with the development of the productive forces, then economic, political, and ecological crises develop, and revolution is around the corner. As Marx continues, quote, "At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure," close quote. Now, it's worth noting that the formulation "then begins an era of social revolution," unquote. In such an era, different revolutionary processes develop, each of which can be explained only based on specific national contradictions and their interaction with the global principal contradiction at the time. a global principal contradiction at the time. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels applied this law to the bourgeois revolution, which breaks out when feudal relations of property come into contradiction with the already developed productive forces. So, looking at the history of the transformation from feudalism to capitalism, we find that in no instance do we encounter a pure bourgeois revolution. Similarly, for the transition period from capitalism to socialism, there is no pure socialism. So it's important to underline what Marx writes in the next sentence in the Critique of Political Economy. Quote, no social order is ever destroyed before all the productive forces for which it is sufficient have been developed. And new superior relations of production never replace older ones before the material conditions for their existence have matured within the framework of the old society. This is important. This is and it's important enough to repeat it. No social order is ever destroyed before all the productive forces for which it is sufficient have been developed. And new superior relations of production never replace older ones before the material conditions for the existence have matured within the framework of the old society. Close quote. In addition, a positive socialist outcome is not given and is not mechanically determined by the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production. The outcome depends on how prepared the proletariat is ideologically, politically, and organizationally. Over the last 200 years, there have been several severe crises in capitalism, creating multiple national attempts to develop socialism within the surrounding dominant capitalist world system. However, capitalism has shown an extraordinary ability to roll back these attempts and assimilate its critiques, finding new escape routes from its problems. The capitalist mode of production has developed the productive forces at a speed and extent never seen before in history, creating growth in the Earth's population from 0.9 billion in 1800 to 1.65 billion in 1900. So 0.9 billion in 1800 to 1.65 billion in 1900 to now, or 7.8 billion in 2020. Fueled on fossil energy and constant innovations of new technology, capitalism has developed an enormous variety and volume of products for sale. However, it's also created hunger and misery for the majority of the world's population that cannot afford to buy the goods they need. Yet the scale of decent living poverty is astonishing. 2.4 billion people lack food security. 3.2 billion cannot afford a healthy diet. 3.2 billion do not have a clean cooking stove. 3.6 billion do not have safely managed sanitation facilities. 3.8 to 5 billion people do not have access to essential health services. This is not because there is a deficit of productive capacity. On the contrary, these goods could be provided for everyone on the planet quite easily. But because production remains overwhelmingly organized around capital accumulation and profit maximization rather than around human needs and well-being. The historical development of capitalism is determined by the interaction between the economic laws of the accumulation of capital and class struggles, entailed by the consequences of these economic laws. Certain conditions must be fulfilled to secure the accumulation of capital. The laws of accumulation can be even expressed in mathematical formulas such as the rate of profit. But actually existing capitalism It's not a machine that functions exclusively through laws and rules of accumulation, nor is it a system of balances and harmony. Quite the opposite. It is characterized by the constant struggle between the different aspects of these contradictions, all those contradictions. For capitalism to function, it must constantly seek a specific historical form that allows it to secure profits and to continue to accumulate capital. This historical form is determined by class struggle. The economic laws create class struggles that affect these laws by modifying the relations of production, creating new frameworks for continued development of the productive forces. This happens not only on the national level, but also in the world system of nation states. The class struggle on a national level shapes the economy and policy of the state, which is part of the world system. These states interact and compete to secure their development based on their class character. The national class struggle affects the world system, which in turn affects the national class struggle. So the national class struggle affects the world system, which in turn affects the national class struggle. So certain circuit there, right? Thus, in the dialectic between economics and class struggle, we should avoid complete determinism and instead think in terms of conditioning rather than determinism. Now, the contradiction between the development of the productive forces and the mode of production had to find different historical forms of existence in which the accumulation of capital could continue. In the 19th century, wealth and raw materials were sucked from the colonial periphery into the center to develop industrial capitalism and the imperial mode of living. The development of unequal exchange became the historical solution to mediate the contradiction between capitalism's need to expand production on the one hand and the ability of consuming power to absorb the produced commodities on the other hand. To be more specific, the development of colonialism via super exploitation in the periphery, generated the value transfer needed to raise the wage level in the center, which was necessary to consume the growing production and thereby realizing the profit of the sale. So you can see how this all connects, this big set of circuits and cycles, things. I refer you to David Harvey's kind of diagram. This was not a cunning plan by capital. It was the result of the development of colonialism and the struggle of the working class in Europe. In the specific way, history found a way in which the contradiction in the capitalist mode of production could move ahead and continue in the development of its productive forces. It created a dynamic economic development in the center and a permanent crisis in the periphery. In the last quarter of the 20th century, new forms of imperialist relations had to be developed to maintain the profit rate, introducing massive outsourcing of industrial production to the periphery to take advantage of the low wages. This is globalization, right? The dialectical process between the economic laws of capitalism, their political and social consequences, and the related class struggles drives the development of capitalism, a development that takes winding roads and is characterized by ruptures. During certain periods, the economic and political system appears relatively stable. Even when revolutionary movements try to change it, the system keeps its balance. However, the system will always be affected by revolutionary efforts. It does not remain the same afterward. During other periods, the system finds itself in crisis. It is no longer able to keep its balance and thus becomes unstable. At which point, revolutionary efforts take on special significance, and revolutionaries turn into butterflies whose flapping wings can turn into a storm. That's quite prosaic, I suppose. The division of the world system into different political entities means that the transformation of capitalism into a new mode of production will require many revolutions and can be subject to reversal, as we have seen. The transitional state will continue to be characterized by class struggle on the national level and by the interstate conflict between pro-capitalist and pro-socialist states. The transformation from one mode of production to another is a long process. Capitalism first took shape over several hundred years, from the Italian city-states of the 15th century to the Industrial Revolution in England 400 years later. The transformation from capitalism to socialism will be a long process as well. There have been devious roads and dead ends. However, at this point in history, it seems that capitalism is running out of both humans and nature to exploit. There is no spatial fix, as forecasted by Rosa Luxemburg in 1913. Quote, once this is reached, Marx's model becomes valid, i.e., further expansion of capital becomes impossible. Capitalism comes to a dead end. It cannot function anymore as the historical vehicle for the unfolding of the productive forces. It reaches its objective economic limit. Close quote. So, on to the third pillar, right? The principal contradiction. If we have a capitalist world system in the historical sense of Emanuel Wallerstein, and in the economic sense of Samir Amin, and if we consider the world system as one process, then at any given point in time, this process has a principal contradiction emerging from multiple contradictions in the capitalist mode of production, driving its development forward. The principal contradiction affects all national, regional, and local contradictions decisively. Like other contradictions, the principal contradiction changes during the course of history. The interaction between the principal contradiction and other contradictions is not one-sided. Particular national and local contradictions affect the principal contradiction. Now, this feedback affects the struggle between the aspects of the principal contradiction, and it can change the direction of its development. Now, Mao Zedong says this about the principal contradiction, quote, if in any process there are a number of contradictions, one of them must be the principal contradiction playing the leading and decisive role, while the rest occupy a secondary and subordinate position. Therefore, in studying any complex process in which there are two or more contradictions, we must devote every effort to finding its principal contradiction. Now, once this principal contradiction is grasped, all problems can be readily solved. It's easy for you to say, Mao, unquote. Anyway, close quote. The expression readily solved should be taken with a grain of salt, not least when talking about social problems and the revolution in a country the size of China. What Mao means when he says readily is that you have a reliable guide for further analysis once you identify the principal contradiction. In other words, the critical problem of defining useful strategies, policies, means of propaganda, and military efforts are solved. Additionally, it is important to find the dominant aspect in the contradiction, as Mao Zedong states, quote, it is a big mistake to look at the two aspects of any contradiction as though they are equal. Of the two aspects, one is inevitably the principal and the other is secondary aspect. And the former is the aspect which plays the contradiction's so-called guiding role. So, in actuality, which aspect is principal? This is the whole dialectic, right? It is necessary to observe the situation of the development of a process, and it will be determined under definite conditions, close quote. So, in defining the principal contradiction, we move from the abstract and general to the specific and concrete, that is, to practice. Right? In defining the principal contradiction, we move from the abstract and general to the specific and concrete to practice. When we act, we do it where we are situated. What else can we do? However, we should act locally from a global perspective and bear in mind the principal contradiction. A determinate historical situation is characterized by a variegated multiplicity of conflicts. And every conflict involves the presence of a multiplicity of individuals and classes who express different opposing interests and ideas. To analyze and get one's bearings in such a complex situation, it's necessary to examine not only the internal configuration of such contradictions, but how they interact and are structured in a concrete totality. So, mastering this is a challenge theoretically as well as politically. To identify the principal contradiction at a certain point in history, we must consider more than the general abstract contradictions. Contradictions such as productive forces versus relations of production, proletariat versus bourgeoisie, imperialism versus anti-imperialism usually do not cause much controversy among Marxists. No, they don't. Disagreements begin when we move from general to specific contradictions and when we need to identify the principal contradiction at a given time and place. The contradiction with the highest revolutionary potential. Now, note that Mao speaks of finding the principal contradiction in the quote above. This cannot be done by theoretical speculation. Contradictions are concrete phenomena. They reveal themselves in economic developments, in political action, and popular movements. As I emphasize, the global perspective and the principal contradiction is important to underline the dialectic. The world-level theory and universal trends consist of all the particularities. It is through the particular and local that we can act. We need to see how the principal contradiction is created and formed by the multitude of particularities and how the principal contradiction determines the outcome of particular contradictions. Now, this is not only a theoretical issue. The grand theory of the global perspective without the dialectical understanding of the relation to the particular is of no practical use. It may give you pleasure in understanding how the world works and a platform from which to voice how unjust and unequal the world is and how it needs to be changed. However, grand theory alone offers no viable path towards an effective praxis. The meaning of seeing things as an interconnected whole lies in the ensuing capacity to act in line with reality thus understood. The purpose of identifying the principal contradiction is to intervene in it. The conscious capacity of seeing the world system as a process and of understanding the direction and the eventual goal of that process. We cannot create contradictions, but we can influence the aspects of existing ones so that the contradictions move in a way that serves our interests. Identifying the principal contradiction tells us where to start. To sum up, in the historical analysis in part 2, I will examine how the general contradiction, that is, productive forces versus relations of production, manifests itself in the specific revolutionary process on the national level. Moreover, I will explain how these national and regional contradictions interact with the changing principal contradiction on the global level. Historical changes happen in qualitative leaps. The productive forces change constantly, and with them, power relations between classes. So eventually, this leads to tensions that shatter the frameworks of the old society and make way for a new one. To then analyze the transition from capitalism to socialism, I have to specify the very concept of socialism. So, there's other things that we can argue with here. Is that a utopian proposition? Is it totalized? How is it that we understand its historical nature, et cetera, et cetera? So this is the end of part 1, chapter 1. In this text, what we probably will do is look at the last chapter without going through the historical development, just simply to get a sense. I think we have the kind of model, and I actually think it's a useful explanation of what others have talked about on the problematic of dialectical materialism, historical materialism's relation to that, the relation to the world system and world system theory, and gives us a kind of opening to where discussions of a multipolar system have sort of come from. That is, in response to set of periphery models and all that other stuff that's happened since World War II. And it does explain a whole bunch of other things. And, it also explains the dogmatism of the dogma of various competing notions that we've seen and continue to see as a kind of undeveloped kind of way in looking at the movement forward. So, and it is a long transition. Now, whether it's a 7-year or 17-year or whatever, there are, long waves, as one might refer to them, of these kinds of things, but they're not wholly economic in that sense, but that they are combinations of all of these things. So hopefully one gets a sense of what that is. So I'm going to come to the end, and this is Torquil Lausen's The Long Transition Towards Socialism and the End of Capitalism. And it's an Iskra book. It's available for download from the publisher's site for free as a PDF. And we will look on Wednesday as a kind of overview of this discussion of the long transition towards socialism and the end of capitalism, part 1, chapter 1. And then probably next week on Wednesday, we will look at the conclusion and maybe a little bit of something else. And then perhaps we will open up into a successive kind of look at other things that might be anti-imperialist and etc., that are part of a related project, and that's where Gabriel Rockhill's work may or may not come into place. I mean, it has its own issues, and I think we'll see that, and you'll see that as well if you start doing the reading.